Just rolling. All right. 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, as promised, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Keith Pompey, the longtime Sixers beat writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Keith, thank you so much for joining the show. I saw you in person about a year ago now when the Sixers played the Jazz, and it's crazy to say this, because things are always, as chaotic as they are in Knicks land, they're always really chaotic in Sixers land, but this is about as crazy as it's ever gotten, and there hasn't even been a game played yet. James Harden, everyone knows the story, but what is the latest on that situation and how it could potentially resolve or start to resolve as we head into the season?
Yeah, it's crazy. I guess the latest is that there's really not a lot of options out there for the Sixers in regards to making a trade with James. The thing with the Clippers that we know that happened a couple of weeks ago that became off the table, and James came out and called Daryl Morey a liar, and then the league fined James Harden. Right now I think they're in a wait and see approach, and wait and see meaning, is James going to report to training camp? And if not, how long is he not going to be a part of the team? Is he going to, if he goes past 30 days, then the league has a right to not allow him, or the Sixers have a right to not allow him to get out of his contract. He's in the final year of his deal. And if he does come to training camp, how is he going to perform? How is he going to act? Is he going to be a teammate, a good teammate, or is he going to make a mockery of the system? So it's really, the Sixers are in a tough situation right now because there's a lot of the unknown. And I hate to say it, if James Harden comes out and he's really disruptive, or if he's really disruptive, I think it could mess up the Sixers season. It really, the Sixers have a lot of lofty expectations this year, but if he comes in and messes things up, I think that the season could go south.
How do you think this, it's impossible to predict, but how do you think this ultimately ends?
Wow. Like you said, it's really tough to predict. And it's hard just because I really, you're around James, but he hasn't been around as many players have in the past. He's only been there for a year and a half. And he's kind of like a private person. You know, you hope for the Sixers' sake, you hope that it gets resolved. Whereas, James is here and he gets traded, he plays out. So I think that ultimately we could possibly see him traded. The only problem is with that is he makes so much money. He's in the final year of his contract. He's 34 years old. So in order for the Sixers to trade him, they would have to lower their value, their trade value that they have of him. So, I think that could happen. And if not, I think it could be a lost year for the Sixers, meaning whereas James just doesn't report, he doesn't come back. And it's one of those things where they just say, hey, we have to move forward without him. But I do think at the end that he'll probably get traded.
I think the logical follow-up that's on the minds of every Knicks fan listening, that they're all screaming into their phones, what does this mean for Joel Embiid, Keith? How is he, just from what you've heard, what if his general feelings been on this situation after obviously a really disappointing end to last year's playoffs?
I think right now, and you see the photos of Joel, I don't know if people in New York saw, but everyone in Philly saw, and they're shaking their head like, what are you doing? But you see, the Josh Harris, the managing partner of the Sixers, is also the managing partner of the Washington Commanders, right? Formerly the Redskins.
Yeah.
And Joel Embiid was at the season opener with Magic Johnson, Josh Harris, and just enjoying himself. You also hear that Joel Embiid has kept communications with the Sixers in regards to what's happening this upcoming season. But it's one of those things where a lot of people are paying close attention to it to see how it unravels, because the worst kept secret in the NBA, and especially in Philadelphia, is the New York Knicks' desire to have Joel Embiid. And if this thing goes left, you look at Joel Embiid, and if the Sixers decide to do a rebuild, the best way to get assets, the best ways to do a lot of things is by trading Joel Embiid. And the Knicks have acquired a lot of assets that they're willing to give up for Joel. So I think that, that's one of the things that to pay close attention to for everyone, the people in New York, the people in Philadelphia. But right now, it seems to be that the word that's coming out is that Joel has kept in constant communication with them. But I don't think that if this season is a failure, right? I don't think that we'll probably, and I could be wrong, but I don't see Joel like being here through his 4-year extension. I think that Joel would ultimately be moved, and I feel like the Sixers will go in a rebuilding thing, and I think that the Knicks could get him. I'm not saying they will get him, but I think that that could be a very good option for New York. Now, I don't think it would happen this season. I think that it will be something, down the road.
Yeah, it feels like one of those situations where what's going to change in Philly that all of a sudden makes them a championship contender. And look, there could be, and I'm sure you guys have talked about it a lot on your show. There's probably some room for self-reflection there on Joel's part. Like, hey, what could I have done differently? Like if I had a different end to game 6, or if I'd had a very different game 7, like would we have been in the conference finals? But I don't really see him putting that on himself ultimately. And in his defense, like outside of the Jimmy Butler year where they lost to the Raptors, like you can argue that he hasn't had an adequate supporting cast to carry a team to a championship. Whatever his postseason failings are, there have certainly been equal failings from the Sixers front office to the coaching staff to surround him with the right talent at the right moments to get this done ultimately. But you say you don't think this will happen this season. Like, is there a world where it does? Like, how bad would things have to get for Joel to look and say, hey, like it's just not going to happen here? Because I think to your point, like he so obviously loves Philadelphia. He clearly wants to get this done in Philadelphia. Like it's going to take a lot for him to get to a point where he's like, all right, I'd rather be somewhere else. But it feels like a lot's already happened and the worst maybe is yet to come.
Yeah, I think when you talk about Joel Embiid, and the reason being is because I feel like there's, Joel Embiid, you can argue that Joel Embiid, when he comes to play, that he's the most dominant player or most unstoppable player in the NBA when he's focused and he really is, ready to come to play. So I think that there's going to be a lot of options for him, right? Via trade, there's going to be some things. But I think that type of stuff, there's going to be a lot of suitors to come get them as well. So I think that's something that you just don't turn around right now, right? I think that there's going to be a lot of, things that are going to come available. And also, not only that, it's one of those things where you look at it and, so you have Paul Reed, you have Joel Embiid. They don't have a lot of other guys on the roster who are coming back next year. Like
Yeah.
they have a lot of guys signed to 1-year deals and guys in the expiring year of their contract. So with the free agency thing coming up, they can say, hey, Joel, what about this guy? Do you want to play with this guy? What about that guy? This and that. So I feel like it's one of those things where in order for you to trade Joel right now, you want to wait until you exhaust all your other options and see what he wants to do. And I think there's a lot of things why they're keeping, constant communications with him to see what they can do to make this roster better. Because let's face it, in the ideal world, you would go out there and you would get another max level player. Then you would sign Tyrese Maxey, and then you would build the roster around those guys. Now you do have Paul Reed, who's a 5'4" or 4'5", whatever you have. But at that point, I feel like you want to exhaust all the other options before you say, hey, we're going to trade Joel now and then go out there and get some things. Because let's face it, the Knicks, right? The Knicks are a team now that are ascending. So yes, the Knicks will have, some draft picks and other things like that. But right about now, when we look at it, the Knicks are becoming a better team. It's different from where you got to hope and pray that the picks that the Knicks are getting from someone else are going to be bad picks. Because, right now it's not like it's OKC or or Detroit Pistons or someone where you know is going to be a definite lottery pick. So, those are the things right there. And then who are the players that you're going to get in return? You're not getting Jalen Brunson, it's one of those things. But I do think that the Knicks are a great option. I just don't think that the Sixers will make that move right now, any move right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that's never been Daryl Morey's MO, right? He's always the guy who's robbing teams that are rebuilding or forcing teams to go into rebuild. He's always a star, ideally 2, 3 if you can swing it. And part of the reason he left Houston was because he didn't have any kind of appetite to rebuild there, and he wanted to win right away. And now it's looking like that could at least be a possibility for them. Because I mean, to your point, they're like you've heard his comments that he wants to maintain maximum flexibility for 2024. But then you look at who's a free agent in 2024, and this has been pointed out by other people smarter than me, but a lot of the best options are the Sixers guys, right? James Harden, Tobias Harris, like who else would be a target for them? Like you're looking at maybe like the duo from Toronto, like Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, and that's who Morey has his eye on, and like a trio of Maxey, Anunoby, and Embiid. But you don't see that one guy that, from a pure basketball perspective, that you're going to say clearly puts you over the top, but also that one guy who you could bring to Joel Embiid and say, hey, this is who you're going to win with. And I think the bet, and let me know if I'm off on this, Keith, like maybe more than anything else, is just that Tyrese Maxey takes that next jump, becomes a perennial all-star, and he's kind of the guy who convinces Embiid, I want to be here. Because at least for me, outside looking in, I don't necessarily see the players like, oh, they get this guy, and Joel says, all right, that's great. I'm here for 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, and then the thing is, like, there are some older players, who are going to be free agents, like Kawhi Leonard, things like that. And on paper, that sounds good, right? But then when you realize, you look at it and you say, well, since he led Toronto to the championship, how many games has he been available, right? Things like that. So, yeah, it's really not a lot of options out there. However, but there are going to be some teams that are going to be willing to trade guys, because let's face it, right now with this new collective bargaining and teams do not want to get in the luxury tax and all those things. So there may be some teams that are willing to send players to the 76ers. But again, once you decide that you're getting rid of Joel Embiid, and you alluded to, you said one thing about Daryl Morey, he doesn't like the hard rebuilds, right? But once you decide that you're getting rid of Joel Embiid, well, you're basically saying we're going to the process part 2. And that's what you're basically admitting. And I don't know if they want to do that.
I've just got to imagine, just from like the Sixers fans' perspective, right? You went through 4 years of hell. There were books written about it, and the promise was, hey, we are going to have this loaded team. But because like they didn't necessarily maximize all those picks, there was certainly, like, you look at Markelle Fultz, you look at Ben Simmons, like we can go on and on and on. There were some bad breaks along the way, not taking Philly's native son, Mikal Bridges. Like, again, like, I say this as someone who's gone through it with the Knicks before, right? Like, we've been told, like, all right, we're gonna rebuild. Oh no, you know what? Let's just swing for a star first. Like, let's just wait a few more years. There have been bad moments here as well, but I just cannot imagine there's any kind of appetite there for like, hey, we're gonna suck for 3-4 years. And we did actually get one truly transcendent superstar of that process, one MVP, and now we're trading him to our crosstown rivals in New York. But Keith, I want to ask a question that I think some people have asked, but maybe hasn't been asked enough. Should the Knicks be all in on Joel Embiid, a guy who, to your point, like, no one can question his regular season credentials at this point, MVP, led the NBA in scoring each of the last 2 years. We noted it earlier, but the postseason track record is a little bit spotty, not just in his team success, but also in his individual success. Like, there are a million tweets over the summer showing every single stat out there. Like, they all seem to go down in the playoffs for Joel Embiid, and not in the way that they go down normally for superstars, but substantially. Let's just say the Knicks had a core of Jalen Brunson and Joel Embiid for a guy who is heading into his 30s. And keep in mind, there hasn't been a center who's made an all-NBA team in their 30s since, I think it was Marc Gasol in 2015 was the last one. Like, how do you expect Embiid to age? And even if he ages well, can he be the number one guy in a championship team if the supporting cast is better than what he's had in Philadelphia?
You know what? I like Embiid for the Knicks. I do, and I understand everything that you said. I understand his injury history. But when I look at that team and I look at Jalen Brunson, who is arguably one of the most underrated players in the NBA, right now we talk about the leadership, we talk about the selflessness that he plays with. Um, and then you also talk about Embiid's relationship with the front office. You know, the same relationship that Jalen Brunson had, before he came. I honestly think that Embiid would be the missing piece for the Knicks. Now, again, when I look at Embiid and I look at Brunson, you look at him and you say to yourself, is this kind of sort of like how at worst case scenario, it could be how like Shaq was when he went to the Miami Heat. With them, you got a young guy in Dwayne Wade, and I'm not saying Jalen Brunson and Dwayne Wade are completely different players, but where it is you have a guy who just had a presence enough to open up things for other people. And then when you look at it, you also look at Joel Embiid. What's the one thing that Joel Embiid hasn't had yet? A championship, right? Joel Embiid has got MVP. He's been injured. He hasn't gotten out of the second round. So whereas you go to another place and then sometimes the expectations in you may not be as high as they were in Philadelphia. And what do? You say, hey, guess what? I don't have to be the man, but I'll be someone that be recognized as a champion. And it's not the first time that things like this has happened. You look at, and I'm going to go back in history. You look at Wilt Chamberlain, right? Mm-hmm. So Wilt Chamberlain was the man for the Sixers. He was the man for the Wizards, the Philadelphia Warriors, the Philadelphia 76ers. But the one thing is when he went to the Lakers, he's made a lot of sacrifices and they won a championship. And we're talking about a Lakers team that had Jerry West and they couldn't get it done. And Wilt Chamberlain comes. So again, this has happened before with Shaq. It's happened with Wilt. And I think that with a guy like Joel, because when Joel comes to play, he's unstoppable. And I feel like that will be a perfect fit, with Leon Rose, Jalen Brunson. It'd be like a former CAA convention. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like it could work out well in New York. I do.
Yeah, I mean, Keith, you took the words out of my mouth. Like when we talked about a potential deal earlier this summer, I was kind of making the argument it's less of a bet on Joel Embiid and more of a bet on who you think Jalen Brunson can be. And we've seen the playoffs, right? Like, what did he put up against the last three games of that series against the Miami Heat, the team that made the Eastern Conference Finals? Like 37, 5-5, like 43 points in game 6. Like he has shown that he is an absolute playoff killer. And I think to your point, I think Embiid would thrive in a role where it's like, hey, you can dominate the first 3 quarters. You are going to maybe be asked to do a little bit less on offense, and you can commit that much more defensively. And be who he has been at his peak, which is like right there with Rudy Gobert for the best defensive player in basketball over the last 5 years. And when it comes down to crunch time, like you have a guy who can always get a shot in Jalen Brunson, who can always ideally set Embiid up for an easy shot in Jalen Brunson. I think the Knicks are building depth to the point that there are going to be tertiary options that are good. There's always going to be shooting on the floor around Embiid. And they have this core and they have a star in Brunson that I think makes Embiid's life that much easier while also allowing Embiid to be the star during the regular season, right? Like he's still not taking second billing to Jalen Brunson. He's still going to be the guy, at least for the first few years there, that would be competing for MVPs. I think it is a match made in heaven in a lot of ways. And if you're the Knicks, the biggest thing you're betting on is that you can keep him healthy, that you can maybe have him play a little bit less in the regular season, that he's going to age well because of and I think I'm curious if you'd agree with this, but because of how good of a shooter he is, because of how skilled he is, because of his size and strength that just isn't going away. And even if he loses 5% of his athleticism, you might see a savvier version of Joel Embiid. And Brunson, at the end of the day, I mean, he just represents the most reliable co-star he's ever had outside of the, 40-something games of Jimmy Butler that he got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And outside of Brunson, though, like, we talk about, there's Julius Randle, of course.
Yeah.
all-star. He made the all-star team. You have Josh Hart, who came in last year. Now you have a couple other players. Like, who would you say on the Knicks is the now? I guess Brunson is the head of the snake, but
Yeah.
outside of that, who would you say or who's the second best player on the team?
Yeah, I still think it's Julius Randle. We've seen a lot of Julius disrespect this summer. I think CBS had him in their player rankings behind Fred VanVleet, behind Victor Wembanyama, behind DeJounte Murray. And this is a guy who made third team All-NBA last season and made an All-NBA team for the second time in 3 seasons, was an All-Star for the second time in 3 seasons. Obviously, the playoffs were not good, but he was playing on a sprained ankle that he then re-sprained against the Miami Heat. So he is look, I mean, for large stretches of last year, like he probably wasn't number 2. He was number 1. Like again, at midseason, all the media, all the coaches looked at it and said, hey, Julius is the best guy on that team, not Jalen Brunson. And maybe some of that was the point guard depth in the Eastern Conference, but there was a legitimate argument, like who was carrying who last year. So I think it's pretty clearly Julius Randle. And we just did a whole podcast on it yesterday, but the Knicks are just so reliant. Like Vegas only has the Knicks at 44.5 wins this year. And we kind of look at that and say, oh, that's ridiculous. They won 47 last year, 57 win pace with Josh Hart. What are they seeing? And I think they're seeing that every other season has been on the Knicks. Julius Randle has tanked. And Keith, that's kind of the big question on the Knicks. Harden's a more obvious one, but if Randle takes a nosedive again, like the Knicks could be just as risky of a bet as the Sixers are. And I'm kind of curious what your take is on which team is better this year, because when we do our like kind of mock Eastern Conference standings, I've seen a lot of people putting Philly down, putting them closer to 5 or 6. And it's this weird thing where like with Milwaukee getting older, with Boston having the Kristaps Porzingis injury, like if the Harden thing wasn't such an open question, you could make a compelling case like, hey, Philly's probably the best regular season team in the East next year. And right now I have them down more like 5, 6, or 7. But am I underrating the infrastructure that Philadelphia is bringing back, or do you think it could actually go that bad?
I think you're a little bit underrating the infrastructure that they have. And the only reason why I'm saying that is because, when we look at it, Embiid, when he wants to play, he's still the most dominant, in my opinion, big man, the most dominant. And I look at it as if that I think that, you got to understand something about the Sixers, and there's a little bit dangerous things going on right now. And what I mean by that is you have a guy like Tobias Harris. Tobias Harris is one guy who a lot of people on the Sixers and people in Philadelphia, they look at the contract and they get a little like, oh, man, they're paying him all this money and he's a 4th option, he's this and that. But the one thing that you have to give Tobias Harris credit for is whenever they're undermanned and whenever someone's not there, he always steps up. Now, is he, you can make an argument that he got paid royally as to be a guy who was not an all-star, but you also got to understand that he got paid that money because he was playing at an all-star level when he was with the Clippers. He just didn't make it. There was a season, I want to say the season that Doc Rivers' first season with the Sixers, you can argue that Tobias Harris should have made all-star, but it came down to him and Julius Randle, and Julius Randle got it. So I feel like with Tobias Harris being in the final year of his deal, wanting to show everybody that, hey, I should still, my next contract should be lucrative, I do expect him to have a good year, especially if James isn't here. Then there's the thing about Tyrese Maxey. Tyrese Maxey is a guy in Philadelphia that, could be a sleeper for the most improved player, right? Tyrese Maxey was on a tear last year. I believe in the 3rd or 4th game of the season, he had 44 points. But it got to a thing where he got injured. Next thing you know, the problem is him and James Harden don't make a quality defensive backcourt. So what happens is you're not going to bench James Harden. So what happened? Maxey had to come off the bench. So I feel like when you have those guys, I think those two can elevate their play. And then you have a couple other guys coming off the bench that will help them out, to whereas there's a lot of teams sleeping on them. And when we talk about like 5, 6, and 7, there's one team that I think a lot of people early on in the preseason, and they get more props than the Knicks, the Atlanta Hawks. Everybody says we look at the Hawks, we look at the young core, we look at Trae Young, and we say the Hawks are going to be that team. And then when the season comes around, you always see the Knicks lately getting above them, right? You see other teams. And I look at like the Toronto Raptors. I don't expect them to be good this year. Other ones, I think that when we look at the East, there's going to be the Milwaukee Bucks. There's going to be the Boston Celtics. I think the Knicks are going to be in the mix. I think the Sixers are going to be in the mix. But outside of that, there's a whole bunch of question marks. And as long as you have Joel Embiid, I feel like they're going to be – now, I don't – like the playoffs is a different story. But when we're talking about an 82-game regular season, I feel like they're going to be cool. Now, another team that people are going to give props to is going to be the Cleveland Cavaliers, right? Everybody's going to talk about Cleveland, but what happened when they played the Knicks in the playoffs, right? And I also feel like, right? So
people don't want to talk about it.
People don't want to
I see Evan Mobley was ahead of Julius Randle on that list. Like Julius busted him on a broken ankle. I don't need to get fired up, Keith. Yeah, go ahead.
And here's something else they don't want to talk about. The thing about Cleveland is they had so many young players who basically made All-Star the year before. They didn't make it last year. I want to see what that dynamic's going to be, because there are going to be certain guys that are like, hey, I made All-Star the year before. I didn't make it this year. But you guys made changes. They're going to want to make All-Star this year, and they're not going to. So right now, they remind me of the Sixers when they had all that talent, where guys, yes, they all talk about the team, but at the same time, they want to get this individual goals. And, you got to get the buy-in. So I think the Sixers are going to be okay, because I don't believe in the Hawks right now. Right now, there's too many question marks with Cleveland, even though they're hyped up. So I feel like the Sixers are going to be, the third or fourth team in the regular season. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I could definitely see it. And I think everyone's talking about what they lose in James Harden. There's some stuff they gain when James Harden isn't there. I think a empowered Tyrese Maxey is the single biggest thing. The ability to put more defense on the floor, whether it's DeAnthony Melton or whoever else takes that starting spot. I think they're gonna. It's hard to underrate what Harden, or I guess overrate what Harden brought as a playmaker, leading the NBA in assists last year. But I do think there's going to be better flow, and you'll have a little bit less of like, all right, it's James's turn to dominate the offense. All right, Joel's turn to dominate the offense, and maybe a more cohesive product. And I guess to that point, I mean, at least on my end, Keith, this is my last question. Like, what does Nick Nurse do for the Sixers? And is this a case of like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, or do you see him as an upgrade over Doc Rivers?
It's funny. Could you say that shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic? I mean, in a way, I think that Nick Nurse is good for the Sixers. Now, I do think that Nick Nurse came into a bad situation. I do, because, let's face it, Nick Nurse was a finalist for the Bucks job. He was a finalist for the Phoenix Suns job. Although he does have Joel Embiid, you look back at it and you say, wow, these other two teams, like, you look at it right now, and they're going to be pretty good. I think the one thing that you don't count Nick Nurse out for, because Nick Nurse is a guy who is known for making crazy adjustments. And that's the best way to describe it, right? He thinks outside of the box. And right now, when you have this team that has the issues, you can't be traditional. Like, you have to think outside of the box to be successful with this team. I think that, but again, I think that he would prefer if the James Harden situation was settled heading into the season. But, you got to give him a chance. Now, the one thing is, let's be real. The regular season and the playoffs are completely different. If you don't have the horses in the playoffs, you're not going to go far. So although I think the 76ers are going to be a quality regular season team, until they get a legitimate point guard or someone like that, or another quote unquote all-star, unless Maxey can develop into that, I don't see them getting out of the second round. Like, I don't see them doing it. And they may struggle in the first round. But as far as the regular season, you know how it is, 82 games. Now they're going to have the in-season tournament. It's going to be a lot of things. You win off of having a Joel Embiid type of player, other guys. But I don't know when it comes down to strategizing over a 7-game series that this team without a legitimate point guard can win a championship. But can they rack up a lot of regular season wins? Yeah, you can. You can, because you don't prepare for a team like you do in the playoffs.
I think so as well. I think Philly potentially going to surprise some people, and I'm looking forward to it from a Knicks perspective, right? Because I mean, two of the most historic franchises in the NBA, but there's never really been a lot of overlap where they've both been good at the same time. To your point, Philadelphia with Billy Cunningham, amazing in the late 60s. Then the Knicks took over early 70s, 80s. Philadelphia was really good in the early part of that decade. The Knicks make their rise in the 90s. The AI era in Philly, the Knicks sucked for that whole stretch. And now we finally kind of have a moment where these two franchises that have suffered so much are good at the same time. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Maybe some consternation there with the Knicks trying to steal away Joel Embiid. But Keith, I know you'll be around to cover all of it. Before I let you go, can you tell everyone where they can find all your great work?
Yeah, you can find my great work. Well, I shouldn't say it that way.
No,
I'm
it's
sorry.
great.
I'm sorry about that. My mom, I can see her smacking me now, or even punching me. But anyway, you can find my work in Enquire.com. You can follow me on Twitter, and also, just like you go to my man, you can go to the Locked On Network and get the podcast and stuff like that.
All right. Thanks a lot, Keith. And we will have many more of these team previews. But for now, that is some Knicks Sixers talk, and we'll talk to you soon, very soon, that is, on Locked On Knicks. All right. Awesome. I got tongue tied.